Welcome in. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're digging into Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
Yeah.
Really going to try to get the full story, beyond the headlines and all that.
Should be interesting. He's gone from, comedy stages to global politics? That's quite a journey.
Right. So we took a good look at his Wikipedia page to really get into it, and I got to say some of the details are surprising.
Yeah, like what? What stood out to you?
Well, for one, he was born back in 1978 in
Right.
Kryvyi, Ukraine, obviously, and his family's Jewish, but he grew up speaking Russian.
Yeah, in that time and place, that says a lot about the culture, all those different influences.
Definitely. And it doesn't stop there either. Like, his dad was a mining engineer, so they actually lived in Mongolia for a bit because of his work.
Wow, talk about cultural immersion. That had some influence on him.
I'd imagine. Okay. So then he goes and gets a law degree. Seems pretty standard, right?
Sure, seems like a normal path.
Except he never actually practiced law, not even for a little bit.
Really?
Yeah.
That's wild, considering what he's doing now.
Totally. Instead, he dives headfirst into comedy.
Which, gotta say, is a bit of a recurring theme with him, when you think about it.
Oh, absolutely. So he
Okay.
starts his own production company, right? Kvartal 95, I think it was called.
That's the one. And they did all sorts of stuff, for romantic comedies, even some satire.
Yeah, didn't he play a school teacher who becomes the president in one of those? Serving to the people?
Yeah. Can you believe that? Almost like he predicted the future or something.
Right. Talk about art imitating life. But anyway, my point is, by the time he got into politics, he was already a household name in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Everyone knew him, and that definitely helped when it came to connecting with voters, Way different from your typical politician.
Totally. So picture this. New Year's Eve, 2018, everyone's celebrating, and Zelenskyy makes a surprise announcement. He's running for president.
And he was already ahead in the polls, if I remember right.
Exactly. And his campaign was totally unconventional. Lots of social media. He kept doing his comedy tours. The whole thing was just different.
Yeah, he was meeting people where they were at, speaking their language, and it clearly worked.
Because in 2019, he wins by a landslide. What a wild ride to power, right?
Definitely. Shows you that people wanted change. They were tired of the same old, same old.
And one of the big things he campaigned on was taking on the oligarchs, trying to reduce their influence, which is interesting because
he had his own history with some of them.
Exactly. So that's something we're going to unpack. But first, a word from our sponsors. So before the break, we were talking about Zelenskyy and the oligarchs. Big challenge to take on.
Huge. Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, he did try to make some changes, to limit how much power they had.
Like what? What do you actually do?
Well, there were these reforms trying to make the government more transparent, make it harder for officials to get away with corruption, that kind of thing.
Okay, sounds good in theory, but I'm guessing it wasn't easy.
Not at all. You got to remember, these oligarchs, they had their fingers in everything. Tons of money, political connections, the whole 9 yards.
Right, so even trying to change things must have been a fight.
Exactly. Some people even say that the system itself, the one he was trying to fix, made it almost impossible.
And not to mention, there were still those questions about his own past, right? Like, how serious was he about really changing things?
Yeah, that definitely made things more complicated, no doubt about it.
And as if that wasn't enough, he had the Donbass conflict to deal with too, right? Like, talk about a trial by fire, first term in office, and you've got that going on.
Seriously, and that whole situation, it really shows you the tightrope he was walking, trying to keep everyone happy, but with impossible choices everywhere he turned.
So he goes into office, wants to find a peaceful solution. Did that work out how he planned?
Well, he tried, that's for sure. Remember those talks he had with the separatist leaders? Really controversial stuff.
Yeah, didn't go over well with everyone, if I'm being honest.
Definitely not. Some people thought it made him look weak, like he was giving in too easily. Others thought he had to try something, anything, to get some kind of peace.
So he was stuck between a rock and a hard place, damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. Trying to balance what was happening inside Ukraine with how other countries saw him, all while Russia is looming in the background. I can't imagine the pressure.
It's intense just thinking about it. And speaking of how other countries saw him, didn't he visit Silicon Valley at some point? That always struck me as interesting.
Oh, definitely. Especially looking back on it now. Almost like he knew how important all that tech stuff was going to be.
Right. Meeting with those tech giants, did he know something we didn't?
It is kind of spooky, right? Because then 2022 happens, the invasion, and suddenly it's all about social media, digital communication, the works.
And Zelenskyy, he really used that stuff to his advantage.
Big time. His government, they were putting out these messages, rallying support, fighting back against all the Russian propaganda. It was like a whole other battlefield online.
And those videos, right? Directly to the Russian people, telling them what was really going on.
Super powerful stuff, and we're going to get into that more because 2022 changes everything, obviously.
No kidding. The invasion, it was like the whole world stopped and watched in disbelief.
Surreal, right? You've got this former comedian, suddenly he's facing down a full-blown invasion.
And what does he do? Stays in Kiev, refuses to leave, even with the Russians closing in. I mean, talk about courage.
Seriously, he could have gone anywhere, done anything, but he chose to stay and fight for his people.
And those speeches. I remember those first few days, it was just him in that green shirt, telling the world what was happening.
Iconic look, right? Simple, but it just worked. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't sugarcoating anything, just raw, honest emotion.
And that line, "I need ammunition, not a ride." I mean, come on, that's the stuff of legends.
Right. That's when he went from being a president to a wartime leader right in front of our eyes. He became the spirit of Ukraine, the refusal to back down.
Totally. And you could tell all those years performing, connecting with audiences, it all clicked into place for him.
For sure, because he wasn't just talking at people, he was talking to them, you know, making them feel the urgency, the fear, the anger, everything.
It was masterful, honestly.
Sure,
and it
yeah.
worked. He had the whole world's attention. Everyone was hanging on his every word.
Yep, he went from parliament to parliament, video calls, social media, you name it. He was everywhere, constantly getting the message out there.
And it wasn't just talk either, right? Like,
Yeah.
he actually managed to get things done, get help from other countries.
Oh, absolutely. He was like a one-man fundraising machine, but for weapons and aid instead of, you know, whatever else.
And it all played into this image of him, this symbol of Ukrainian resistance.
Yeah.
I mean, people got tattoos of the guy.
Crazy, right. But that's the power of a good story of someone who embodies something bigger than themselves. But we got to remember, Zelensky's not just about this war, you know. He's got his own ideas about how the world works, what he wants for Ukraine, all of that.
Right. He had a whole platform, a vision for the country, even before the invasion.
Exactly. And part of that was getting Ukraine into the European Union, NATO, the whole shebang.
Yeah, those were big goals for him, I remember. He really saw those alliances as like the key to keeping Ukraine safe, especially with Russia always being a threat.
Exactly, like an insurance policy for the future. But he also said he'd let the Ukrainian people decide for themselves, you know, referendums and all that.
Which, you got to admit, is pretty impressive, considering everything that was going on.
For sure, he could have easily been like, look, we're in crisis mode, got to do what I say, but he didn't.
So even in the middle of a war, he's still trying to be democratic about things.
Exactly, shows you what his priorities are, you know? But what about the rest of the world? Like, how does he feel about China? That's a whole other can of worms.
Right. They're kind of on the sidelines of all this, but still a major player on the world stage. So where does Zelensky stand on them?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? I mean, how does he see them? They're not exactly Russia, but they're not exactly, you know, on our side either.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? They've kind of been playing both sides a little bit.
Okay, so walk me through it. How has Zelensky approached dealing with China?
Well, he's definitely been more cautious with them, that's for sure. He hasn't been shy about criticizing Russia, but with China, it's more like he's, I don't know, kind of sizing them up still.
So not exactly buddy-buddy, but not enemies either.
Exactly. He's walking this fine line, trying to keep them on side without, like, relying on them the way he relies on the U.S. and Europe.
Makes sense. It's got to be strategic about these things.
Totally, especially with everything else he's got going on. And that's what gets me, like, we've covered a lot here, but I don't think people realize how much pressure this guy is under.
It's insane, right? Leading a country at war is one thing, but then you add in all the politics, the diplomacy, trying to rebuild while you're fighting for survival. I mean, come on.
It's mind-boggling, honestly, and we're just sitting here talking about it.
I know, right? And you can tell it's taking a toll on him.
Oh, for sure. You see it in those videos sometimes, just for a second, the exhaustion, the weight of everything.
Yeah, those moments where the mask slips a little and you see the human being behind the, you know, the wartime leader persona.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, he's still just a guy, right? But what a story.
It's like something out of a movie, isn't it? Comedian to president to like a global icon of resistance who saw that coming.
Right. I mean, if we were having this conversation a few years ago, before all this happened, would we even be taking him seriously?
Probably not. We'd be like, Zelenskyy, the comedian.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. But history's funny like that, isn't it?
No kidding. It just to show you things change fast, and you never know who's going to rise to the occasion.
Right. Like there's a whole lesson in there somewhere about underestimating people, judging a book by its cover.
100%.
Yeah.
But Honestly, this deep dive has really changed my whole perspective on him. It's one thing to read the news, but this is different.
For sure, context is everything, right? Knowing the backstory, the motivations, it makes you see things differently.
Absolutely. So, big picture, what do you think? What's Zelensky's legacy going to be? How will history remember him?
Man, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's almost impossible to say right now while it's all still happening.
True. It's not over yet, is it?
Nope, not by a long shot. And who knows what twists and turns are still coming.
Okay, so maybe it's too early to write the history books? But we could at least try to sum things up a little, right?
Sure, I think so. Like, at the very least, he's shown the world what courage looks like, what it means to stand up for what you believe in, even when the odds are stacked against you.
Absolutely. And he's done it with heart, with humor, with a genuine connection to people that's got to count for something.
It's huge. He's not just some distant figure, he's relatable, he's human, and that makes his message even more powerful.
I couldn't agree more. Well, this has been an incredible deep dive, insightful, thought-provoking. I always learn so much from our conversations.
Me too, honestly. Always a pleasure to pick apart these stories with you.
The feeling is mutual. And for everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this journey into the life of Volodymyr Zelenskyy. He's a complex figure for sure, but hopefully we've shed some light on his path, his choices, and what makes him tick.
Yeah, and even if you don't agree with everything he does, you gotta admire the guy's tenacity,
100%. All right, everyone, that's it for this deep dive. Keep those questions coming, keep learning, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
See you next time.